Good morning, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this morning's live panel discussion, which forms part of the Workplace and Facilities Expo's virtual festival. My name is Hugh Robinson, and I'm the Exhibition Director for Workplace and Facilities Expo Ireland, which unfortunately cannot be held physically this year due to the pandemic. However, Workplace and Facilities Expo will take place next year on the 1st and 2nd of March 2022 at the RDS in Dublin, and we look forward to welcoming you in person that year. The virtual festival commenced yesterday with the first two panel discussions, and today will be no different, with this session on security in the morning and one addressing fire safety in the afternoon. Each of these panel discussions features industry leaders and experts discussing key areas affecting all those involved in creating safe and secure workplaces and facilities, whether in Ireland or internationally. As well as the live panel discussion, the festival also has a range of on-demand content which can be accessed through the Workplace and Facilities Expo website. This morning's webinar is entitled Security, Issues in a Remote Working Environment, and features an exceptional set of panelists with a wealth of experience. The session is organised in association with the ISIA, and I would like to thank them for their assistance in sourcing speakers and moderating the content. If you would like to ask questions, please put these through the chat box, and the panel will address these at the end of their discussion. This webinar will be recorded and will be uploaded to the Workplace and Facilities Expo website as additional add-on content. This morning, the moderator for this morning is Sarah O'Donnell, Communications Director for the ISIA. So without further ado, I shall hand you over to Sarah. Sarah.
Thank you, Hugh. And I'd like to say thank you to StepX for asking us to help with coordinating this event. And also well done for having the courage to organise Workplace and Facilities Expo online this year. That takes a lot of courage, and we certainly know in the ISIA, we went through it at the end of last year, organising the ISIA Awards online. So really well done. And again, thank you for asking us to be involved. And thank you to all of you for joining us this morning for this security panel discussion. My name is Sarah O'Donnell, and I am the Communications Director for the Irish Security Industry Association, the ISIA. For those of you who are not familiar with the ISIA, we have a very long history. We are now in our 50th year acting as a voice for the private security industry. We were formed in 1972, so we'll celebrate our 50th birthday next year. And we represent companies in all areas of private security, and we have 9 different divisions of membership representing those sectors of the private security industry. We've put this morning's panel together to specifically address the security concerns that you may have already faced and continue to face in this new social and commercial landscape in which we are living. And I dare say for longer than I'm sure most of you would have liked. The panel with us this morning has a really diverse range of experience in security, and they were carefully selected to ensure that you have your questions answered and leave this morning's session with clarity around areas that you can action immediately, or perhaps simply give you the reassurance that you need, that you've already addressed the risks associated with your workplace. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our panel. We have with us this morning Martin Stairs, Jill O'Riordan, Steve Kenny, and John Nealon. Thank you all for giving up your time and being with us here today. We are very grateful. I'll ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their experience in the industry. Martin, if you don't mind, I'll start with you. Will you please introduce yourself and your role or roles, as the case may be, in the security industry?
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. I'm a security and risk management consultant. I have a long time experience across the security industry, and mainly where I see my role today is one of the areas of risk management in security. The changing working environment, my expertise in relation to writing reports, doing investigations, and ultimately giving evidence in court in relation to security, what are effectively security failures, will, I hope, bring to, today some enlightenment into the challenge that we will face. I'm currently the chairman of the Security Consultants Division of the Irish Security Industry Association.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you. And Steve Kenny, may I ask you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so I'm Steve Kenny. I'm the industry liaison manager for Axis Communications. So I guess most people will see Axis as probably one of the largest video surveillance manufacturers in the world. So my role is really to support the consultant community that are specifying projects, but also work with government organisations and industry associations. And part of the sort of the day-to-day role is really working with organisations like the ISIA, a Security Institute, ASIS, where I sit as one of their board directors. And I really sort of work with government organisations to see how we can legislate in regards to security technologies, and really support the wider community as well, just making sure that the security can add value to businesses and their organisations.
Thank you so much, Steve. And Jill O'Riordan, may I ask you to introduce yourself?
Of course. Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everybody. My name is Jill O'Riordan. I am currently the chairperson of the Static Guarding Division within the ISIA, and currently employed as an operations director with Mighty Facilities Management Limited. I have considerable experience in the security sector, having previously worked for G4S Secure Solutions in Ireland. And the main expertise that I bring to the panel today is assessing and understanding client needs from a risk perspective and balancing the commercial proposition in terms of the challenges currently faced within the environment that has presented itself with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you, Jill. And last but certainly not least, I'll introduce you to John Neelan. John, if you would introduce yourself to our delegates.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and good morning to all here this morning. My name is John Neelan. I'm Managing Director of Data Protection Training Auditing Services and also a shredding company called M1 Document Solutions. We've been delivering data protection and data destruction services for the last 12 years. I am a postgraduate qualified certified data protection officer, and I'm the designated data protection officer for 15 companies with an annual turnover of over 350 million. We've recently partnered with Cyber Risk Aware to provide cybersecurity e-learning managed platform and service with simulated phishing campaign capabilities. What I hope to bring to this session this morning is some practical insights into the challenges involving data protection with regard to increased remote working and more people being on more sites.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, John. And again, thank you to all of our panelists for giving up their time today to help us to make this a valuable session. So we've had some questions submitted in advance, and we'll address, we've tried to put those together to avoid overlap, and we'll go through each of those questions. However, if you do have other questions, you can, of course, submit them in the chat, and we will do our best to cover as many as possible. So I'll get started and take the first question. Okay, our first question. My business is not operating at full capacity in terms of delivery of our services or staff on site. We don't believe we need to invest in security in the same way as we always have. How do you believe we can best address this need to adapt our approach to security without compromising on risk management? Martin, I'll maybe ask you, that's quite an overarching question. I might ask you to start with that question, if that's okay with you.
Yes, Sarah, that's fine. I suppose one of the key parts of that question is I don't think we need to invest in security the same way as we always have. And that is one of the things that I have found as a risk management consultant dealing with security for clients of mine, whether they be small, medium, or multinational companies, that the financial question seems to be the first to be raised, right? And while that is understandable from a business perspective, from a security perspective, it's not necessarily the right question to ask, because this is about risk, and it's about managing the risk that occurs within a business. And just because a business might be operating at 50% capacity, unfortunately, that does not mean that there's 50% of the security risks have been eliminated or have gone away during that time. As a matter of fact, there may well be cases where the risk increases in those situations because there's less people about on site, so it may be easier for people to access site and get into the premises. So one of the important things is to assess from a risk basis first, not just to arbitrarily decide to cut the costs. I am aware of a number of court cases that I've been involved in over time where the financial cost-cutting exercise has led to an increased risk. For example, if all your security systems and procedures are written around having 2 security guards on patrol at different times around the building, one is there to support the other, or in a retail environment, you have two people, one on the floor and one in the control room, but they support each other. If you take a financial view and say, well, our trade is down, so therefore we're going to cut that in half and we'll only have 1 security guard on duty, what happens then is if there is an incident, that security guard has no support. There's no support. You haven't changed or written your risk assessments. You more than likely haven't changed and written your procedures. And if that person is injured in those situations, right, the companies are exposed to a potential insurance claim and will find it very difficult to defend it because they haven't reassessed the risk. And the important thing with any business change, right, is to reassess the risk. Unfortunately, security doesn't normally get a seat in the boardroom of most companies, and it's something that risk tends to get left behind, and it becomes a financial battle. But it's important that while costs are always important in any business, it's very important that the financial risk doesn't dominate, and that somebody can make, if you make a proper risk assessment, you can make a proper judgment on what the level of investment will be. Within the because of there's a change in security and a change in focus in many businesses, it's important that you look at the risks that not that are just internal but are external. There are huge risks facing businesses with remote working. We are not aware. This is a new phenomenon. Nobody has written procedures around home working. If you follow the Health and Safety at Work Act, it would mean somebody has to go into somebody from the company needs to go into somebody's house to do risk assessment on their working environment to show that it's a safe place of work, right? But that's somebody's private residence, so we're in a very grey area. But if somebody has an accident as a result of, the company supplied the computer and all the cables and I tripped up and I banged my head while working at home, that may well be a very difficult situation for an employer to defend. So again, you need to look at the risks around all of that. And I suppose one of the other things, the other risks, is the whole question of data and data protection. And that is where I would hand over to John. And John can maybe give us insight on the data side of it.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. I think the point that that's most relevant there is the whole area of the risk assessment. And as part of that risk assessment, you have to look at the cybersecurity risk. If you have, and what I'm advising clients is that if they have policies already in place, it's not that because people are working from home that these policies are no longer relevant. If anything, they have to be reassessed, and because there's higher levels of risk where you have little pocket of devices all around the country, rather than in one core central building, if you want. So, and I suppose the other area that where if people have cyber insurance, and I think that might be insurance might be coming up later on. But if people have cyber insurance, you know, the insurance company asks, have you got physical security procedures in place for unauthorized access for hard copy data? You know, so is there documents lying about on the kitchen table someplace that really shouldn't be? Are they insurance documents? Are they personal data? So the hard copies have to be managed. You know, have you some system in which those documents are either brought in centrally back to the office for secure destruction, or have you got another system where they're destroyed at the house? The other issue is, never has encryption, two-factor authentication. You know, these are all quite basic type of IT security measures, but never have they been more important, because of the very fact that you have such a physically spread out network of computers anymore. And I suppose I'll be coming back to other issues, but keeping to the risk assessment, really your technical and organizational measures that underpin how you are going to secure data, as detailed in the GDPR, the 4 letters that keep on giving. But the technical and organizational measures need to be reviewed with, you know, when most people undertake their IT security policy or their technical and organization measure, generally speaking, they might have 100 computers in 2 buildings and with 1 central server or whatever it is. It's an entirely different proposition when people have been given access into companies' IT infrastructure from 50 different locations. You know, it is different. It's not just you roll it out or whatever. And the last point I want to say, and I suppose it's very specific to data protection. If you're expecting somebody in your business to access company data, and particularly access personal data, you need to give them the tools to do it. You should not be relying on their personal PC or their personal laptop in their house to do so. And we are still seeing regulated entities asking their employees to use the PC that the kids play Fortnite or whatever else it is on, I don't know, on their own PC, without giving them a company PC that's designated just for company work. And the Data Protection Commissioner has been quite strong on that. A data controller they're negligent in the sense that you cannot control data on somebody else's personal PC. You can really only control data on your own company provided PCs. I hope that's...
No, that is wonderful, John, and a really good overview of areas for consideration. I'm thinking, Steve, as John was speaking, I was thinking Steve Kenny will definitely add.
So I wholeheartedly concur with what John and Martin are saying. So in the last 12 months, strangely, what I've seen in lots of different organisations is actually the value that security practitioners bring to their businesses, because never before have people relied on security so much. And their influence on decisions being made at boardroom level is really starting to impact them in a very positive way. So I think in a positive, we've seen the importance of security really being elevated. There's 2 things that I see from the challenges. Is the first is that we see vacant properties now. So there is no longer that situational awareness just from members of staff actually identifying unknown people walking around sites. And when John speaks around sort of data and cyber security, I think that's probably the biggest challenge that we potentially have seen, because in order for businesses to carry on and operate in some form of normality, they've basically given a lot of staff access to their secure network. Now, what we've seen is people just open up their networks and allow their staff to connect to very sensitive pieces of information. And one of the biggest challenges we've seen is that a lot of organizations will require staff to dial in through a VPN, so a virtual private network. And essentially, they've never had the capacity to accommodate 100% of their staff working from home. So in order to keep business operational, they've sort of gone beyond or hidden around best practice and sort of navigated their way around some of their own policies in order to keep the business going. And then, as John rightly said, when we consider the security and the integrity of the information that is being shared around the business, it is so reliant on human behaviour. So we are relying on members of staff to behave in a certain way, to log on to systems in the correct way, to go through virtual private networks, to do multi-factor authentication, all of these things. Whereas if they're sat in an office, at least we can keep that environment secure through physical security. But now we are so heavily relying on other people maintaining the security of the information that's flowing around a business.
Here can often be the biggest risk, and sometimes just an error. Yes, Martin, you want to
just to come back on that one, on the whole data, I'm aware through a client that I have, for example, who would do a large amount of financial transaction processing, normally through effectively a call center, where there would be credit card details, bank details, etc. And they have very strict policies and procedures relating to the gathering and accessing of that information in their premises. But now they have a lot of their workers working remotely. And they have had a situation where somebody was approached with a view, because they had easy access to the information, i.e. they're at home, there are no controls, they're sitting on a laptop at home, there's nothing stopping somebody writing down credit card details and hanging on to those details, whereas they have controls within the call center to prevent that, but they don't have them necessarily in somebody's home. And the person was approached with a view, now in fairness, the person involved alerted the company immediately and so on. But there are pressures, could be pressures on individuals working from home who have access to very sensitive data that they would never dream about doing anything with that data when they were in an office environment, in a secure office environment. But there is and always will be a temptation that if somebody finds themselves in a certain set of circumstances and has access to that information may leak out. So risk assessment on what people are actually doing and how they are doing it in their new workplace, i.e. their home, and on what piece of equipment, as John says, is it the family PC, or is it a proper encrypted PC belonging to the company? So there are risks that we haven't foreseen. Another area where I am aware is, and it's not an area that I don't want to get heavily involved in, but there have been incidences relating to domestic violence where people are working from home because it's putting a different strain and a different dynamic into the family. And these are something that employers need to be very careful and wary about. And I know there's a very thick line or thin line, depending on which way you want to look at it, in relation to that transition into someone's personal life. But this is what's happened because of COVID. The business and the personal life has been greyed. And that's something that needs to bear in mind, when companies are looking at their remote work.
That's great, Martin. Thank you. John, do you want to add something before we move on to question 2?
Yeah, and just very quickly, I know that Jill has to make her contribution, but it's just on the monitoring. Most, the higher the risk of the personal data that a company might be involved with, and whatever, or financial data, the higher the monitoring that generally goes on at a computer level, and most companies would have the policies and procedures and the transparency needed to do that monitoring. But it comes back to that core point. You cannot monitor somebody's personal PC. No matter what policy you have, you cannot monitor what somebody is doing on their personal PC in a remote work room. So you must give them that equipment. And if it costs $1,000 or whatever it is per person to kit that person, you do need to have that, because that is the only way then that you can legitimately and legally monitor the activities of that individual.
Yeah, very, very good point, John. Thank you for that. We're going to move on to question 2. So question 2 is, we're finding the commercial landscape and the environment we operate in ever changing. How are your panel members providing solutions to their client base in our new and unpredictable normal? Jill, would you mind if I start with you for that question?
Yes, sure, of course, Sarah, no problem. That's a really, really good question. And I suppose, if we start from the beginning, there is a view that security is expensive when in fact security is priceless. And going back to Martin's earlier point, it's all about a risk-based approach and balancing the commercial proposition to that. We will have seen throughout COVID-19 and the pandemic, we will have seen assets, depopulate in terms of their people population. We will see additional controls come in where they may, for example, monitor the activity of what personnel are coming in and indeed if they're coming in out from a cohort perspective in order to keep critical functions running. But I think it's important to know that Martin has touched on it earlier, and it's a very valid point. It's not as simple as saying you've got a building where you've got 336 man guarding hours and you cut it in half. The asset is still in place. The asset still needs to be protected. Your access egress points are still in place. But not only that, as touched earlier, your physical landscape in terms of what you're operating in, it may change. So where you have high populations and volumes of people traffic throughout the day, this has now reduced considerably. And you're at a very fine line in terms of moving into a vacant property perspective, where you can actually have a whole bank of commercial buildings where there were, for example, 80 to 100,000 traversing in and out every day for work, that now you've less than 1,000 coming in. So that in itself brings another set of risks that need to be examined. Certainly the experience that I've experienced, and a number of colleagues in competitor environments as well, is basically in these situations, and again back to Martin's point, the risk-based approach is critical, because you need to, first of all, your risks are not exactly the same as they were pre-COVID. That's just a fact. Your buildings have depopulated. Your physical and the external landscape has changed from a number of perspectives. But once that's determined, it is then, as I said, security is always seen as an expensive, but it's actually, in fact, priceless. As Martin says, the claim culture that we have in Ireland, and you can lead to a claim very quickly. But it's taking that hybrid approach, and even feeding back into Steve, it's understanding what static guarding is required to manage the risk present at the time. It's understanding mobile patrols, and they help. Move monitoring into a security operations centre. Invest further into technology. And of course, all of that leading back to the communication of the employees coming into the site and how that is being managed. And those risks, I think, from a number of perspectives, when you see a lot of businesses where they've suffered double-digit revenue declines, you quickly start looking at, well, is this low-hanging fruit? We'll cut security because there's nobody in the building. Look, it's grand. One officer can do everything. As Martin said, an incident occurs, you've only got one officer in the SOC, he moves out, he misses other activities that are going on. We do know that our Gardaí are deployed in terms of manning COVID-19 restrictions, so response times may be a little slower than they previously were. all of that needs to be factored, I think, when determining how you're changing your landscape to deal with what you have, because it's not as simple as a commercial cut through the bottom line. And I think that's where a lot of companies need to understand that to understand and analyze the risks that are in place, and then work with a partner to provide, a compelling solution in terms that works, first of all, in mitigating the risk that presents itself, but equally that it's commercially attractive for them when they are suffering from double-digit declines. And look, there are a lot of premises in Ireland that, with the vaccine as it rolls out, we certainly have numerous clients that are not going to repopulate their buildings until the cohort that, work in their buildings have been vaccinated. So you're now going into Q3, Q4. So, it's determining a two-prong approach really, in terms of, I need to have a current risk assessment and a current security proposition in place for where I am now. I then need a second approach in terms of, as I begin to repopulate, and how we're going to do that. And again, physical distancing is going to come in inside the premises. And as Martin says, and equally John, we are probably going to look further down the line at a 3 and 2 model, which is 3 days in the office, 2 days at home. So what was the predetermined risk assessment, I suppose, pre-COVID-19, is going to be a very different risk assessment when we as an economy return to normal, because that will not be the place. We see more and more that we're getting the right to switch off, as Leo Varadkar has recently announced. That's coming into place. People don't want to do the commuting anymore. We're now starting to see a Dublin, probably East Coast centric businesses where people live in this eastern belt saying, actually, no, we want to move to the country. Infrastructure, I think, from a government perspective, is going to come into play. And you're going to have people coming out. And I think that 3 and 2 model is going to end up, we're going to have to reassess, relook at the landscape, and I think design new risk-based approaches to that, commercially balancing that proposition. And really feeds back, I think, to both to Steve and particularly John, as John has said, the numerous risks that home working now presents. As Martin equally said, the Health and Safety and Welfare at Work Act, if you trip over wires at home, are you in the situation it's a workplace accident, even though you're working from home and it's work provided technology? So I think there's a lot that's going to come to the fore. But I think, the key for me, speaking to any client or to anyone, is determining the risk that presents itself, and then working in partnership with several companies in terms of determining that proposition, that solution where risk is mitigated. And that's what I would say, Sarah. Thank you.
That was great. Jill, thank you so much. We really are living in a different time. And as you say, when we return, things won't necessarily look like what they did pre-COVID. And we really do need to start taking all of that into consideration. Would anyone else like to add to that? Steve, yes, please.
Yeah, so if I look at it from what we're seeing in regards to sort of technologies, I think there's got to be an acknowledgement that there is a desire for people to get back to the office. I think everyone's got working from home fatigue now, and I know Martin loosely mentioned some of the sort of domestic challenges of working from home. So, but there's a whole host of things that people need to consider now, and a lot of businesses have over the years made significant investments in their security technologies to keep their people, their assets, their buildings safe. And what we're starting to see is how they can best adapt these type of technologies to really embrace things like social distancing. So we know that we've got sort of the fairly good visibility of most buildings to make sure we've got the security covered, but it's looking at how they can take that technology in and link it to access control systems, audio systems. So we know, okay, we've got X number of people in a meeting room, that's a capacity, so we can send some form of notifications. And if we're looking at security, and to be honest, John's probably better positioned in this. We're seeing people using sort of thermal detection type technologies to monitor people's temperatures going in and out of businesses. Now, I have seen from governments the whole host of privacy related challenges that brings, because capturing someone's temperatures as part of medical data, and from a GDPR point of view is seen as fairly sensitive information. So there obviously is the data protection element of that people are speaking about. So it's just really adapting security technologies and making sure that they can support the business in their future operations. Some of the trends that we're seeing around access control, and we're seeing people speaking around frictionless access control or contactless access control. So we're minimizing the touch points in and around the business. Visitor management systems are going some form of frictionless. So a lot of the enrollment can be done in advance of turning up to site. So it's just trying to mitigate or take away some of that unnecessary human interaction and allow people to navigate their way around buildings securely, but from a sort of a frictionless way. And I think this has accelerated a lot of things that people have been discussing for a number of years. Now, these aren't new topics that people have just brought out the ground. It's just accelerated the deployment of these technologies because people want to get staff into their sites, but they want to do it in a safe, practical manner and in a secure manner as well.
That's great, Steve. Thank you so much. And that point that you raised about the GDPR risks on things like thermal technology. John, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I suppose there are a couple of things on it. Some of my own clients have installed thermal imaging linked in with facial recognition and whatever. Firstly, these innovations are good if they support the business objectives. If the business objectives is that thermal imaging reduces the transfer of COVID within the workplace, grand, knock yourself out. But the bottom line is that the health data, the health data on that is unclear, because you mightn't have a temperature for a week when you're in the most contagious phase. So that's the first thing. But then if you go then onto the GDPR, what I've been saying to people is, right, so you put in a thermal imaging scanner. What do you do if somebody has a high temperature? Are you a medical person to be able to assess somebody? Are you able to determine, well, that person is fit for work and that person isn't fit for work? Are you going to pay somebody to go home? Do you know what I mean? So by bringing in some of these technologies, if it's a proven method to reduce transfer of COVID, that's good and that's proper. And GDPR as I keep saying, is an enabling piece of legislation. There's nothing in GDPR that is stopping people from putting into place practices and innovations that will stop the spread of COVID. But it has to be done, in a transparent and open manner. So it has to be done that, if you're going to put in these thermal imaging, that it is only for the purposes of detecting high temperatures, and that you have a very clear idea of what is the procedures if somebody has a high temperature. Do you know what I mean? And so what I'm really saying is, money is tight. If businesses are going to invest in these innovations, have a clear business purpose, have clear policies, and have clear follow-up procedures, that if something is detected, what do you do then? Because unless you have all three, it could be money that may be better spent in other places.
I think you're absolutely right, John, and that's key. I think having the correct process in place, because I think there's been a huge lack that if you have a high temperature, there's almost the assumption and belief you must have COVID, forgetting the fact you cycled in 15 miles from home and you're hot, and yes, your temperature is up, and that would take 20 to 30 minutes to reduce. And is there a procedure for second testing? Is there an isolation room in place? And I think you're absolutely right in terms of, is there a competent person determining who goes home, who doesn't, the process and the procedures in place? And I think that's very, 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 very critical within organisations.
And if I can just come in and just one other thing, and it's another piece of technology. An awful amount of companies have thumbprint, clock in, clock out technology, and they are very accurate, and they're very, it does overcome the issue of fobs and things like that. But the data protection authorities have all indicated that there's data, because it's biometric data, have all indicated that there's particular problems with that type of technology. And if a company, so let's think of it, and most people start, as Steve says, that there's a grow for coming back to work and coming back into the office. And a company now insists, well, you're going to use the thumbprint clock in, clock out. Well, you didn't need to do it when they were at home. So why do you need to do it now when they're going back into the office? So the actual arguments to support the installation of some technologies may be much less. And you have to remember, if there's a complaint, and it goes in front of the Data Protection Commissioner, well, and the Data Protection Commissioner says, hold on, thumbprint, no matter what algorithm you use, is still using biometric data. You didn't need to do it when people were working at home. So why do you need to implement such sensitive, or process such sensitive data now that they're coming back into work? Would a fob not be better? I'm just saying that this is an area that may need to be examined from both a policy point of view and implementation.
Thank you, John, and Steve and Jill for contributing to that question. An awful lot of items for consideration, and good points made. So thank you for that. Martin, do you want to add anything to that before I move on to the next question?
Yeah, I suppose I've seen clients who have rushed out and they've asked me to come along to do a risk assessment, last year. Because of COVID, and I arrive in the premises and I find all these thermal cameras and everything else, and you say, well, since people involved in security, what's the policy or the procedure, or why has it happened? And someone says, oh no, it wasn't us, it was HR. And I said, yeah, well, what procedures have you got in place? Who's control? Nobody seemed to know. There was a rush. Like every technology, it has its uses, it has its worth, it has its value, but they haven't really assessed as to how they're going to use it. In other words, what happened, most companies that I'm aware of, vast majority of them installed thermal cameras, and within 3 months of them installing thermal cameras, the vast bulk of the workforce was working from home. So the thermal cameras were not being used to the level and extent that they initially thought, because of the environment had changed. We were now in a rather than being in a controlled situation, we were now in a lockdown situation. So therefore, when you're looking at any form of technology, you really have to look at the pluses, the minuses, and as John says, the different locations. If it's valid in one location, why is it not valid in another, or not being used in another location? If you have to go through a very strict procedure when you're in the head office, yet you're sitting on your kitchen table and you've got probably more data exposed publicly than you'll ever have in a corporate office. So all of those things need to be looked at completely and properly assessed, right? And if you make those, a good risk assessment isn't that costly when you're dealing with purchasing technology. But the one thing that will happen is, if you do a good risk assessment, you will then be able to make the right choice to pick the right technology that you need, right? And not just go and say, oh, well, we need technology to solve the problem. You need to identify what the problem is, what the risks are, and then tailor-made. In other words, the dearest solution or the cheapest solution may not be the solution for you, right? So you need to properly decide what you want this system to do. Is there any future requirements that you may need it to do? And is it capable of doing those? So not just buying effectively something that will work for today. So if we look at it now, we may be looking at technology solutions, as Jill says, in office environments that are not at full capacity by any stretch of the imagination, virtually empty buildings. But if we're going to do that, we also need to look at the other side of the coin and say, well, is this system capable of benefiting us when we come back to full occupancy, right? So, in other words, not do a short-term assessment, to do a long-term and a broad assessment, so that you have the right technology for the business, and technology, as I'm sure Steve would say, that has the potential to add on extra modules, extra things. You may not have to buy them now, but if the system's capable of being expanded into that because of a certain set of circumstances that may arise, that's the type of sensible investment that needs to be done. But you need to do that from basically going back and looking at your business and how your business is going to operate now and into the future. Yeah. So
thank you. Thank you. That was great, and thank you to all of our panelists. Lots of food for thought for our delegates. I will move on to our next question. I'm cognizant we're about halfway through our allocated time, but there's still plenty of time to go. Our next question is, we have over 100 staff working from home, and we have assessed the data protection and staff well-being risks that this presents. What do your panel believe are the biggest risks, and how do we ensure that we have addressed them all? Anyone want to put their hand up to start? Martin, thank you.
This has already been partially covered, but
yeah, of course. But you might want
to the working environment is the great unknown here. The home working environment, right? And as I said earlier, if you adopt the Health and Safety at Work Act in relation to a working environment, it's a double-edged sword in that there are conditions. The Health and Safety at Work Act is not all about what the employer does; it's also about what the employee does as well. And it's important that the employee has an involvement. But the potential, given the legal system that we have in Ireland, and that anyone can sue you, right? There's no restrictions on who sues who, right? If somebody feels that they have had a workplace injury, and that could well be somebody in the future complaining about a bad back because they're sitting on a kitchen chair all day, the position at which they're seating is not properly ergonomically designed. They're sitting on the sofa with their legs crossed, with a laptop sitting on their lap, right? All of those things have a potential, right, for the company. So a good way of getting around this would be for companies to issue, if you like, home working guidelines, right? So say that you should sit properly, you should, and then if the person doesn't do that and injures themselves, well, then the company have some protection. I'm a great believer in. We talk about the claims culture in Ireland. Having spent years in the courts and given evidence in cases, I don't tend to adhere that we have a claims culture, right? Yes, we have a huge amount of claims. What I do see is that we have a no blame culture, right? And that is, people won't take responsibility for their own actions. If something happens, they feel somebody else is to blame, and how they solve that problem is they go and sue somebody, and if they get money, well, then they say, well, it wasn't my fault, it was somebody else's. So anything that may happen within the home environment, and we've seen this before, just drivers of vehicles who are driving home after been working long shifts or whatever, working for companies, have taken actions against companies where they've fallen asleep at the wheel, and they claim it's because they were worked too long or too many hours. So there is a huge potential there. So when you've got that many people, you have to adopt the same policy that you adopt in the workplace. In other words, if you do assessments in the workplace, right, for all your employees, and you have a health and safety rep who goes around and has a look at risks and that, and eliminates those health and safety risks, whereas you cannot go to everybody's private dwelling, you can issue guidance to all of those people and say, here's the guidance pack for working at home, right? Much as would happen within, for example, construction. They have things called method statements, where somebody writes out the method under which a particular job is going to be undertaken, what measures of safety and protection are put in place. Well, the same can apply to office environments. And I think that if companies do that, they would have, in the event that there may be a claim in the future, they would be in a lot better position to defend that situation, right? Have they got a set of guidelines and that staff had signed up to those guidelines, right? So the risks, there's all the other risks we mentioned, but that is one that I see is a real unknown. We don't know what's going to happen. And it's like anything, when an unusual claim is made and there's an unusual court case or an outcome in a court case, that gains publicity, and that by itself results in other people thinking, well, you know what, I think I've had an accident that's worth making a claim. So they tend to be, once they start, they don't stop. Other people start to think about their situation. So a good company needs to have those policies, procedures. And just because somebody's gone out the front door with some files under their arm and a laptop, the employer is still employing them. So there's still the duty of care. And so the employer has to be seen to be acting in what is required under law is reasonable, right? Not exceptional, right? So in other words, the company has taken reasonable precautions. So if the company says, well, look, we cannot come into your house to do an assessment, but here is the guidance that we're giving you for working at home, that's reasonable. And I think it would be unusual that in and I'm no legal expert, but it would be unusual that where reasonable precautions have been taken, that an employer would be found against, right? If they're the only reasonable precautions that they can take. In other words, they can't go into somebody's house, right, or demand to go into somebody's house to do an assessment. So they need to take that into account, and to balance that situation, as John says, the difference between, is there a difference between working at home or working in the office, right? And if it's your work, well, the location may be different, but the procedure should be very much in line. But I suppose it's like if you get a set of procedures working in the Dublin office, right, there may be slightly different procedures working in the Cork office. Well, the same applies if that office is now your kitchen or your study or your spare bedroom or whatever. You need to put all of those in place. And I think if they do, it will certainly go a long way to meet the employer's obligations to their employees in home working.
Thank you, Martin. And really so much of it comes down to giving, as you say, due consideration to the items that need to be assessed and putting the right policies and procedures in place. I will move on to our next question, unless somebody would.
Yeah, can I just
add to that? Oh, John, sorry.
And I suppose it's particularly because it just mentions the data protection risks. I sort of came across a very useful document, and the Data Protection Commissioner has another one, but it's some of the do's and don'ts for working remotely, and so a couple of the do's was do be more vigilant in relation to phishing emails. Phishing emails have increased something like 80% since the start of the lockdown, or start of last March, from the previous 12 months. So, your company should be sort of, if they have 20 or 30 people working from home, you should be effectively testing them in terms of phishing emails and so on and so forth. Put your processes and procedures in place. Clear lines of communication. If something goes wrong, who do you contact? So we had a case, it was an accountancy firm where they're all working from home. Somebody clicked on a link in an email and sort of thought it was strange. That was around maybe 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and didn't actually ring anybody until the following morning at 9 o'clock, you know, and somebody had been snooping around the whole server for that evening. So that clear lines of communication. Who do you talk to? Equip the staff I've already dealt with. The don't connect to public Wi-Fi. Don't forget to back up centrally. If you've got if people are working from home, there still has to be good backup and restore mechanisms in place. And maybe Steve might want to talk a bit more about that. Don't use personal computers or devices, and don't forget about the password and two-factor authentication. You know, it's not rocket science, but there's a lot of companies that I have experience of that just don't have those basic do's and don'ts in place. And maybe that might be a good addition to Martin's home working guidelines, that there would be your physical security, your health and safety risk sort of security and all that, and then also maybe a do's and don'ts on the data protection side of things.
Thank you, John. And again, as you say, it's not rocket science. It's not rocket science, but it's taking the time to give consideration to all of these points. And maybe when the pandemic first hit, we were all in a panic. We suddenly were thrown into this new way of working, a new way of doing things that we had never experienced before. But we have now had the time to take stock. And I think it's so valuable to be reminded of all of these points that we maybe didn't get time to consider in the early months. And really, if we haven't considered them yet, need to sit down and take a moment to reflect on these different items. So thank you very much.
Sarah, can I just add a little bit to what John was saying? So what I've seen over the last number of years really as well is there's a lack of awareness when it comes to IT security and cyber security. And I think it's largely down to just people go to sleep at night thinking it won't happen to me. And that couldn't be any further from the truth, unfortunately. And when we say now the businesses are so heavily reliant on their staff when they're working remotely, I think what we're missing is a huge opportunity to add some form of education and training to staff to basically say these are the risks, so people can acknowledge them, and just so people individually know how their behaviour can impact the larger organisation, and why it's so important that they do follow the processes or some policies that organisations need to put in place. Because I don't think it's negligence. I think people that have just gone from logging into a computer in the office and now working from home, they just genuinely don't understand that clicking on that email or clicking on a link where someone says you've won the Spanish lottery, but they've never been to Spain, well, they're still going to click on it because they could be 20 million euros better off. And it is just that lack of unknowing that if I do these things, how is it going to compromise my business? Because it's just an innocent behaviour that people are blissfully unaware of, unfortunately. And I think we just need to educate staff in a far more proactive way of what it is that they need to do in order to protect themselves and the business.
Wonderful point, Steve. Thank you so much.
Sarah, can I just
add that, Jill? Yes, please.
Because I fully agree with John, Steve, and Martin. And I think what's key, the theory emerging at the moment, and albeit it's very new and it's not majorly underpinned yet as we still traverse through the COVID-19, is that I think companies need to adopt a policy for home working in conjunction with office working. I think an interim solution is not the answer, because I think down the line we are going to see a balanced approach to working between the home and the office. And I think companies will need to devise that policy and start engaging with their staff. As John has rightly said, even the small do's and don'ts, they really are critical, and they need to form part of the policies going forward, even though we're in the middle of the pandemic, because we are not going, as much as there are people that want to come back to the office, there's equally a cohort that doesn't want to come back to the office. And there's equally going to be the balancing of COVID-19 as it moves on for another 18 months or so until globally we get on top of this issue. And I think now is the time for companies to start devising that policy and start ingraining the procedures, because I don't think it's going to be an interim piece. I think it's going to be a long-term piece. And I think it's going to be a hybrid and joined up, as John rightly said, between office working and home working.
Certainly, Jill, and thank you for pointing that out, because I think it's something that is so important that businesses do need to consider going forward. Will I move on to our next question, panelists? Yes. What are some of the best security technological solutions to manage risk in this new landscape? Certainly, technology forms a big part of, it's not the only way to mitigate security risks, but it does form a big piece of the solution. So what are some of the best technological solutions to manage risk in this new landscape? I'm looking at Martin or Steve, one of you to start.
Yeah, I suppose, well, probably both of us, but yeah. I'll kick it off. I suppose the big thing here is, again, it's, and I often ask clients, as an independent security consultant coming into a client, I'm not selling a particular product, and I have nothing wrong with people who sell particular products, because that is their job, and they will extol the virtues of the technology that they are selling. And that is perfectly fine. My role as an independent consultant would be to advise the client. And one of the first things I will ask the client is, technology is one of those things, it's nice to have. Lots of people think, oh, we have a great system, it does this, it does that, it does biometrics, it reads palms, it can do this, it can do all these other things, right? But what is the need? And one of the big issues is, it's not about we need technology, it's about what you need it to do for your business, right? And there's no point in spending a huge amount of money on a massive, and I'll just give an example, perimeter security system. If the perimeter isn't really the issue, because if you've got a set of gates and loads of people are allowed in and out, well, then really your perimeter isn't an issue, right? It may be an issue at nighttime, and there are things that need to be taken into account as well. So you really need to look at the needs that the business has for security. What is the benefit in having it? Are we going to reduce our costs base? Are we going to reduce our stock loss? Are we going to improve how we process things? Are we going to use the technology to integrate with other systems that we already have, like in warehouse environments where they may have labeling technology, where they want to be able to identify when goods leave on a particular vehicle? So they're going to use CCTV technology. So it's all about the need. It's not a question of we must have CCTV or we must have access control. It really is designing something that the business needs and that will bring a benefit to the business for the investment, in addition to the security elements that it brings. Can it bring added value in terms of their operations? Will it link in with their main accounting systems, procurement systems, distribution, or whatever? And I've worked on a number of those projects recently, and it's amazing when you get the right people in the room. Somebody says, oh, well, maybe we'll spend, $100K on security. And I've had a couple of projects recently where they spent in excess of 500,000 or 600,000 because the case that was put forward was the business sense case, right? Rather than just a basic system, right, to do a particular functionality. At times it's worthwhile spending the extra money. So you really need, when you're looking at technology, not just look at what the system does, but what it can do for business. A lot of companies, and the reason why people like myself and many of the consultants that Steve would work with are in the business as consultants, is because we do that piece for the company. We talk to them, right, at a level that is for their business, not just for their security. A lot of contractors, and they're the backbone of installing all of this equipment, but a lot of contractors sometimes will try and sell what they think the customer will buy. instead of thinking what the customer needs and selling them that solution. And that's a big difference. And that's the difference between a small sale and a big sale. And I'm sure Steve would agree with that. And I'm sure he deals with both contractors and consultants on that basis, that they're looking to expand out the product into the market for the
client. So where we see it, and I think an honest piece of advice that I've given to everybody over the past 12 months is don't make knee-jerk decisions. Think long-term. So don't buy stuff to address today's challenge, because it might not be tomorrow's problem. And it's about making sure that the investment is fit for addressing what we need it to look at today and how we can move it forward. And I absolutely agree that it shouldn't just be about security technologies today. It should be how that security can enhance sort of business efficiencies and how it can add value beyond just what we see as the traditional security applications today. And actually, when we start to evaluate what the job to be done is, it's amazing how many other stakeholders will contribute financially to these projects when they think, actually, the deployment of these new technologies will help support me in health and safety, HR, it might look at staffing levels, all of these things. And that is just building on a long-term strategy. There's a couple of things that I've put down where we see people deploying today that are, obviously we've got a big sort of focus on social distancing, track and trace, all of these things. And I mentioned it earlier when we're talking around frictionless or contactless access control. We also need to consider what the strategy is for businesses. And one of the things that is quite a contentious discussion we see spoken about is whether or not security from a technology point of view remains on-prem or it goes to the cloud. And what we've seen as security as a service, access control as a service, a lot of that is being migrated to the cloud. And Ireland being the data center capital of the world, obviously it's something that you understand more than most countries. And it's just evaluating how that strategy will work. I've seen from a security point of view, people say, well, we're not there yet, it's not as secure. Well, if anyone's been to any of these cloud sites, they're like little mini prisons that have got the best security on site at the data centers. And then you think, well, actually, all of their accounting data, predominantly in the cloud. You've got all of their sort of customer data, it's already in the cloud. Why shouldn't their security equally be in the cloud? So we're starting to see quite a big drive towards those type of applications, where people go, well, we have vacant properties. How can we make sure that our systems remain operational? And actually, we have them connect to alarm receiving or monitoring sensors just to maintain the security of these sites. So there's lots of different types of technologies and applications, but it is just think long term. Don't invest on something that you think needs to be addressed today, because it might be completely irrelevant in 12, 18 months' time.
That is great, Steve. Thank you for that. And actually, before I move on, I might just add in there, Jill, do you want to add how the human solution can complement that?
Yeah, absolutely, Sarah. I mean, again, I suppose I go back to the earlier point. It's all about the hybrid solution to it. And again, I think what's key to all of this is it's people. People are predominantly the driver of this. So as much as we put solutions in place, be it physical solutions in place, technological solutions in place, people are the key driver of that, which ultimately leads to the communication of that flowing through. And I think Steve is absolutely right. The technology is key, and he's right. The challenges we face today are they're not the end game. That is for sure. We know that this is a constantly evolving piece. And again, I think just to go back to that, it's driving the behaviors and the communication with people, and it's bringing that together to change the landscape as we move forward.
Thank you, Jill. That was very useful. Does anyone else want to add anything before I move on to the next question? Okay, thank you all. Our next question Okay, it's more relevant to small businesses. What are the key security solutions that a small business with limited budget should look for at this time? Quite general. Who would like to first take that one?
Well, I can start if you'd like, Sarah. I suppose when you look at a small business, I think it's key to note that, particularly with a small type business where they don't have the massive, in terms of national or global IT infrastructure, that perhaps not everything can be done at home. So I think that's one of the key considerations in a small business where you have big, large tech sector, multinational. It's easy to decamp to a home environment and go back. Not as again, with a smaller business, it will depend on if they're exporting or so forth. But not only that, I think key to a smaller business in terms of the commercial proposition when balancing their risk is to take the whole of they may not have the budget for mass cyber infrastructure. So bringing in a monitoring solution in terms of a mobile patrol solution where they may not be able to have a physical solution on site, I think they're all valid concerns in determining the proposition to the commercial risk that they may have, because definitely smaller businesses, it is harder for them to move out. It is harder for them to have all the policies and processes and procedures in place for home working and indeed back up, because again, their software packages may be quite small. They may not be cloud-based. They could be server-based in the office. Again, as Steve said earlier, will they have a VPN in place? So there's a lot of considerations there. And equally, you'll generally find, as John pointed out earlier, and Martin, their secure destruction of data and material is probably a higher risk because not everything is digitized or based on software packages. So there's probably, from a smaller business perspective, far more hard documents, tangible documentation in their own place as they navigate through the pandemic.
Thank you, Jill. Does anyone want to add anything else to that piece?
Can I add something? So I think when we talk around cybersecurity, small businesses instantly think, well, I'm of no interest to these hackers. I'm absolutely fine, when statistically they get targeted just as much as the big organizations, and to some extent they're the low-hanging fruit. When we consider that the theft of someone's data, when it is taken from a business and sold on the dark web, one person's account details or contact details can be worth €50 per individual. So if you take a doctor's surgery where they may have 1,000 people registered to that doctor's surgery, they're being targeted all the time, but they don't invest in security to some extent because they don't think that they're at risk or they're a threat. And the reality of it is that they are equally, if not more, at risk because they don't have IT security people, and they don't have security staff in place. They don't have policies and processes. So small businesses are being targeted, and they need to do the same level of due diligence on the people that they want to work with as any other business. And actually, it's not about investing hundreds of thousands of pounds on technology. It's about investing what budget they have smartly. And there are organisations that will do monthly reoccurring revenue models. So you don't have to go and find a huge capital expenditure to invest in these systems and these technologies. Find organisations that you can split the monthly costs out. And I know Jill from her background with monitoring centres and things, there are businesses that will do this, and they do it incredibly well. And it's a cost that they can pass on to the specialists to support their organisations.
Yeah, agreed, Steve.
Yeah.
Excellent points. Yes.
One of the things when I'm doing risk assessments, and one of the things that most companies forget, right, and they ignore because they think, well, it won't kind of happen to us, and that is the whole area of reputational risk. Right, and I have seen companies who have been hacked and have lost data, and their clients have lost faith in them. So it's been, it's not a theft as we call traditional theft. It's not a theft of goods, or it's not a loss of, right? It's a loss of reputation. In other words, somebody says, hold on a minute, I'm employing you to do X or Y or distribute my products, and your systems have now been proved to be vulnerable. I'm not happy. I'm moving my business somewhere else. And there's been articles in the paper in relation to horse racing where reputation has suddenly been affected by a piece of technology that was used to take a particular photograph, and suddenly somebody has lost confidence and they're moving their string of horses to someone else. So reputational risk is huge for business, and particularly small businesses. If you've got the old 80-20 rule that 80% of your business comes from 20% of your clients, if you have a loss of data and it's publicized, right, or not even if it makes the papers, but you've got to ring somebody up and say, by the way, the list of particular items that we've been hacked and we've lost. That loss of reputation is something that a huge amount of companies do not value or really look at until it becomes a problem. And I think, if anything, a company should really look at how they are protected, right, first, right, and what they do in the event that something happens. So I think it's very important that they grasp this whole idea. It's not necessarily the traditional technology that we talk about from a security perspective. It's using the technology and the processes and the procedures there to minimize and mitigate the potential for a reputational loss for a business. I think John wanted to add something to that.
Just to add on to that, so that's your IT systems, IT architecture, so on and so forth that Martin is talking about. But as well as that, the human side of things, particularly for a small business, can't be overlooked. That is why, as Steve came to your e-learning, cyber training is invaluable in today's day and age. And it's not big beer. It's not big money. You know what I mean? You can put in very good training programs in place for maybe, for a company of 20 for a $5 a head a month. It's not big money, but it does reinforce that cyber. It tackles the biggest problem, which is human error. Human error is the biggest problem. If you take a firewall, an average firewall will filter out about 98% of all phishing emails and bad emails and one. But it still lets in 2%, and it's what people do with that 2% of emails coming into their email boxes that is doing the damage. And it's not a personal data problem, but if you take a small food manufacturing company and they have 20 or 30 staff, and an email comes in and it's accessed. This is a sort of a story that I came across. So the email was accessed by one of the kids at home on the home PC. It was clicked on and nothing happened for the weekend. But actually what the email was, it was a ransomware and what it affected was one particular server within the business. So it wasn't that they took any data, they just encrypted it. But the server that they encrypted was the printer server. And the problem with that was that all of the labels for all of the food that was being produced couldn't be printed off. And effectively, for 3 days, they could do nothing. And they're supplying Lidl and Aldi and SuperValu. They could do nothing for 3 days. When you have a food commodity, you've got food going off on one side and you have angry Lidls and Aldis on the other. That's not a good combination to have in any man's language. And I suppose the other side of it is, the ransomware people, they run it as a business. They have customer service support. You know what I mean? So these are very, very organized. The emails are very good and very convincing. And the only way that, and they will get, some emails will get through your firewall, your antivirus, all of that. And the only way to stop it is training the individuals between the two ears. This is what you do if this happens. And I cannot, and that's it. I suppose it is a security solution. Is that all right?
You're on mute.
No, I was saying that's a very good point, John, and it has come up again and again during our discussion this morning. Very often, it is the human error, albeit not malicious, but an innocent error, and that is where addressing your risks, trying to mitigate against them, and policies and procedures, and communicating to your people will be of such help. Would anyone else like to add to that before I move on to what will probably be our last question before we go to chat? Am I okay to move on then?
Yeah.
Okay. Apologies, I seem to have, my document has gone a bit funny on me. I'm gonna close it.
Do you want one of us to read out the question?
The last question, I have it here actually. Are there security challenges that you foresee businesses facing as society reopens more throughout the coming year? What are businesses likely to overlook? What do they really need to think about as we begin to reopen, hopefully?
I'm happy to go first. Sorry, Martin. I suppose if we're to look at it holistically, I think there's going to have to be a recalibration of security from a risk-based perspective as we come through COVID-19 and we come out the far side. Theory and evidence that we're receiving at the moment is that this is a pandemic, and yes, we all agree that, but it is not the first and it's not going to be the last. I think from a cybersecurity perspective, a physical security perspective, a technological security perspective, and indeed from systems and packages that company uses, I think we are going to go through an evolution, and I think that is all going to come down to communicating and the changing of human behavior in terms of embracing new policies and procedures, because I think the pandemic has given us one thing, is this will not be the same at the end. There are discussions of theoretical models emerging of 3 and 2 working from home. We're going to go into blended solutions, and I think secure destruction, cybersecurity, they are all going to come to the fore. I think in terms, and again, obviously my hard bias is towards the physical security. I think where we have physical environments, they are going to change. I will take Ireland, for example, and I'll take Dublin, as myself and Martin and Sarah and John were all based in Dublin, well, John a little bit outside. If we take the city centre, for example, think that we are culturally going to change in Ireland. What was a city centre where there were people traversing in and out on a daily basis to go to work and come back, we are probably going to see down the line a revival of the city from a hospitality and events perspective. That is going to change the profile of the people that are attending into the city centre, which will ultimately change the external and physical risks that, companies whose assets will experience. Again, just speaking in Ireland, we already see that Justice McEntee the Minister is looking at changing the licensing laws. That in itself is going to bring another set of risks that will need to be understood, particularly when we look at the city centre and surrounding from an external guarding perspective in terms of the environment. But I suppose for me, I think we are going to see a recalibration of security. And I think there's still more things to emerge. But what we do know, I think, is that there'll be various models come into play. The human behaviours are going to become key as new policies and procedures are rolled out. Everyone will have to adapt. If we look even climatically, we are all starting to move towards carbon neutral zones. That again will change the environments we're going in and out of and what is there. So I think for me that's what we're going to see going forward. Sorry, Martin, I beg your pardon.
No, not at all, Jill. That was excellent. I suppose where I was looking at is, again, from the risk, whereas we have been talking from the start and during the course of this about people moving out of offices to work at home, the risks will be coming the other way. People who have worked at home who may well be coming back to the office. And I can see their potentials, and John has alluded to this already in terms of use of biometrics and that to get into the office, but you don't need them to get it at home. I can see employees saying, well, if I can wander around in my pajamas at home, why can't I wander around in my pajamas in the office? And that might be very, very simplistic, but the things that they used to do at home, in other words, well, I can have my lunch whenever I want to have it. I can take a break whenever I want to have it. Why am I tied into all these other controls and measures when I'm in the office, when I'm totally flexible at home? So they're going to be challenges for employers to deal with, and people say, well, I don't want to come back to the work environment because it's too strict or it's too controlled. I'd rather work at home. And the company's saying, well, we'd rather have you in work. So there's a lot of challenges there. And I think probably it's been mentioned, but the biggest single challenge is the time spent commuting. People have got used to not spending time commuting. And that is people are going to say, well, excuse me, if I can't work from home, well, maybe I should think about changing my job, right? So I think the workforce is going to be a challenge for a lot of employers that people may start to consider. So employers may well have to consider the option, and as Jill says, maybe a 3-2 working week may well be the solution to that problem. In other words, well, you're not going to get it all one way or all the other way, but there is going to be a bit of a balance here. But I can see lots of people, and because Jill mentioned about the social and Dublin opening back up, as an entertainment venue, anyone who's living outside Dublin will probably say, well, I want to work Thursday and Friday in the office because of the social activity that traditionally happened on Thursdays and Fridays after work, right, and into the weekend. So you can't have everybody working in the office on Thursday and Friday. So again, there's going to be a balance as how you work out who comes back and on what day, particularly if you're going to try and change the working environment in terms of the number of people through a social distancing that you can have on a particular floor, which may be different than previously, right? So there's a huge amount of challenges that are there, not to mention all of the other ones from the security and cyber sides as well. So it's a difficult time, and I think for employers, and I think maybe our rush to want to get out of lockdown, right? We're willing to park some of this stuff, but I think it's a conversation that needs to be had, so that people are prepared for it. We were unprepared this time last year, so we should really look as businesses to try and be prepared and try and sort of work out what may happen and what the changes may be, so that we can manage them. Because at the end of the day, any business has a core element. It's the piece that makes the money, right? And businesses cannot constantly be distracted by a whole load of other things, right? They have to get back to doing what they were set up to do, which was to produce whatever and to sell it, right? So they really need, while they have the opportunities at the moment, it's important before things open up, the companies kind of get on top of those things, so they're ready to hit the ground when there's someone fires the starting pistol and says, right, we're off, we're back to a new normal, right? So that's the challenge, and I think what we've all had today has contributed to that. I'm sure somebody else has something to say on that.
Thank you so much, Martin. Would anyone else like to contribute to that?
I'll just add that I see it as both as a challenge, but also as an opportunity. The way the businesses look at security now, and hopefully what we will see is an opportunity for security functions to collaborate. So we're looking at enterprise security risk management or converged security. So we've got the physical, the electronic, and the people elements of security, as well as IT, all working together now to look at the overarching sort of security challenges that businesses need to face. I think that'll be both a challenge and also a great opportunity.
Thank you so much, Steve. Jill and John, do you want to add to that, or are you okay?
No, I'm thanks.
That is great. To our panel, thank you so much. I can only imagine that our delegates this morning have benefited greatly from your knowledge and your expertise, and you've given them you've provided such worthwhile points and left them with a lot to think about. And that will only help them going forward. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel, but the tunnel is still quite long, and the light might look quite different than the light we saw last year before we entered this new environment. So, and I think that all of the points you have made this morning really contribute to addressing what needs to be considered as we exit that tunnel. So thank you so much. And thank you to StepX for arranging this morning's event. A wonderful opportunity to share your expertise with the end users of security services, and so many businesses do need your advice. So thank you, Hugh, and the team at StepX for putting this together.
Sarah, thank you. And I just wanted to come on at the end and say I found that discussion fascinating. I learned a lot. Obviously, some of the stuff that has been discussed about coming out of this, StepX and Workplace and Facilities Expo will of course be adopting all the necessary safety measures and distancing measures when the event happens again March next year. And it will happen in March 1st and 2nd next year, because like most businesses, if it doesn't, we've got a whole range of different issues that we need to be addressing economically. The only disappointing thing for me is that to find out that Spanish lottery ticket isn't real. But thank you for that. And on behalf of StepX and the Workplace and Facilities Expo, can I thank you all for your time? And yeah, that's it. Goodbye. My colleague will now let us all leave the room. So nice to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.